Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Harold Holzer, director of the Roosevelt House, and it's a pleasure on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, president of Hunter College, to welcome you to this very special event. And on a day when there's another report of turmoil at the White House and the stock market has gone down 500 points again, and a superstorm is bearing down on New York. Isn't it nice to sit here and to be ready to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt? I think so. Which seems like a time to be yearned for. So because we're the Public Policy Institute at Hunter College, we have few opportunities as other more literature-centered centers on campus have to discuss fiction. We have hosted Colin McCann and Tom Mallon over the last few years. And tonight we make another happy exception to our focus on nonfiction, and that is to welcome the acclaimed novelist Amy Bloom to our midst. She is the Shapiro Silverberg Professor of Creative Writing at Wesleyan, and of course the best-selling author of Come to Me, Away, Lucky Us, and other books of fiction, and I should note, nonfiction. She is here, as you know, to talk about her new book, White Houses, another of her wonderful historical novels, but her first, I think, to deal with historical characters. Not that she doesn't animate the characters in her historical fiction to resonate as if they are living in the times, and in this case, exploring so brilliantly the relationship between Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorena Hickok, between the First Lady and the First Friend. A novel praised by Joyce Carol Oates, no less, as a quite wonderful book, a remarkable, intimate, and yet informative novel. I should say, as we talk about Eleanor and Lorena, the First Lady then of New York, soon to be First Lady of the United States, and a reporter. This is a house that has an interesting relationship as far as Eleanor and reporters is concerned. During the transition to the presidency, when FDR and Eleanor occupied this house for the 4 long months between Election Day 1932 and Inauguration Day 1933, reporters camped out, originally on the street, to cover the president-elect, hoping for tidbits of news, very much in the manner of reporters staking out Trump Tower in the cold in November, December, and January of last year. Eleanor felt sorry for the reporters outside, and so she invited them in to the lobby through which you passed, not far from where you signed in. They were camped out there with the tripods and the cameras and the steno pads, smoking away. There's a lot of smoking going on. But Eleanor was kind enough to make sure that they were sheltered from the winter of 32-33. It is always worth having as our guest the supreme Eleanor Roosevelt biographer who will be in conversation with Amy Bloom, our dear friend and Roosevelt House champion and ally in great causes, Blanche Wiesen Cook, who has published 3 volumes in her epic biography, definitive and epic biography of Eleanor. Blanche is Distinguished Professor of History and Women's Studies at some other, at John Jay College, but in our system, in the CUNY system. And as some of you know, she is a Hunter alumna, class of 62, and very proud of it. It's hard to believe. And we're happy to have in conversation with Blanche and Amy Bloom, our own Bill Goldstein, who is our programming curator here at Roosevelt House. He will lead the conversation before opening up to an audience Q&A. And as you all know, those of you who've been here often, we will follow with a reception and a semi-mandatory book signing upstairs. So thanks to Amy Bloom and Blanche Wiesen Cook for being here tonight to inaugurate Women's History Month. This is the first day of Women's History Month, so this is a particularly meaningful event and particularly meaningful people to have the conversation. So Amy Bloom, Blanche Wiesen-Cook, and Bill, take it away.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Harold. And following up on what he says, what Harold said about Eleanor Roosevelt's generosity to reporters in 1932, when I was preparing for this and reread portions of Blanche's first volume, I came across what I think is actually Eleanor Roosevelt and Lorena Hickok's first meeting, which happened in this house. And that was when Eleanor Roosevelt was about to become, or had just become, First Lady of the Empire State, as Blanche writes. So I thought I would just read that quickly. Eleanor Roosevelt did once invite Hickok to tea at the 65th Street house when she was first assigned to interview the First Lady of the Empire State, which surprised Hick. It was most unusual for a reporter calling for an interview with a woman in Mrs. Roosevelt's position to be served tea. It had never happened to me before. I watched with fascination the graceful way she manipulated the tea things with her long, slender hands. She was wearing a lace-trimmed hostess gown, considerably more becoming than the things I had seen her wearing around headquarters. But the hairnet was still there. It turns out that they talked more, as Blanche narrates, about dogs than politics. I failed to get much news out of her, but I was so impressed with her graciousness and her charm that I ended my story with this sentence: "The new mistress of the executive mansion in Albany is a very great lady." So I think if we think of that and then read the portions of your book about their continued relationship and then read White Houses, I think there are certain details that now stand out from this otherwise bland narrative account that might hold some messages about what their relationship really was like. So the lace-trimmed hostess gown, the long, slender hands, the graceful way she manipulated the tea things. But I wanted to talk, following up on that, a little bit about the history of their relationship and then how that provoked you as a novelist. So I think we'll come to Blanche a little afterwards. I'd like to hear from Amy first about what in the story of Lorena Hickok and Eleanor Roosevelt provoked you to want to know more about them in a way that was only possible in a novel.
Well, part of it is I wrote a novel because I'm a novelist. I feel like this is like when they used to ask Willie Sutton why he robbed banks. He said, "Well, that's where the money is." I know how to write novels. There was already the best possible biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. So, I mean, I like the idea of being provoked into writing a novel, which is pretty much how it feels, that somebody would have to provoke you into undertaking something like that. But a great deal of it was in fact Blanche's book. I had done a lot of reading about the Roosevelts because for a novel that was set in the 1930s and 40s, I was doing a lot of research, and you cannot research that time without falling over the Roosevelts all the time. Everywhere you go, there's a Roosevelt. And I had read a number of biographies, but I had not read one like this one of Eleanor Roosevelt. I hadn't read one that seemed, among other things, from my point of view, as somebody who was no kind of a historian, and also, I'm sorry to say, seemed to have slept through most of American history in high school. So I learned things on every page from Blanche's book, but also I learned about the stance of a historian and the capacity to be open in the writing of the history, really, from Blanche's book. This would be very easy for me to do nothing but just like have a love fest with Blanche, because I think that biography is so extraordinary. And what it opened for me, besides saying to me, in a quiet biography way, "Amy, go to the Roosevelt Library and read the letters yourself," which I did. it just seemed to me that the narrative of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's life, which is a great and impressive and compelling life, it's not necessarily the life of Eleanor Roosevelt, and the life of Eleanor Roosevelt, also a great and compelling life. It's not necessarily the life of Lorena Hickok. And so I found myself very moved and engaged by the love story, especially after reading the letters, and my feeling that it had been erased from history. My dad was a journalist, and he used to say to me, and he was a great newspaper reader, although he wrote mostly for magazines later in his life, but he said, never forget every article's written by an actual person, honey, and every person has what they think. And I thought, well, it was very helpful to me in reading history as well. So I wanted to illuminate this complicated love story, and I had some interest in writing about a long relationship. It had been something I had been thinking about for a novel in any case. Just, I'm not a kid, and so I am interested in the long run in general, and how things shift and change, and what stays, what remains, and what falls away. And both those things really brought me to this relationship, and it was a pleasure to move imaginatively through the known facts. I mean, there are millions of ways of approaching a novel. I could have given our planet 3 suns. I could have set the Depression in 1964. I could have made Eleanor Roosevelt a high-kicking showgirl who had married up. But I preferred, although that's not a terrible novel, I preferred to sort of stay with the known facts as much as I could, and then use my imagination for the things that were not necessarily known.
Well, that's a good segue, Blanche. Can you tell us, your first volume of the Eleanor Roosevelt biography, which details the beginning of Eleanor and Lorena Hickok's relationship, the first volume goes to 1933. What are the known facts, and how did you, writing and publishing in 1992, approach what you say in the introduction to your book, that the documentary record is in tatters, and yet you were able to draw so much from what remained?
Well, the fact is the documentary record is there. And what wasn't there is a willingness on the part of historians, on the part of journalists, to accept that Eleanor Roosevelt had love in her life. I mean, this was such a no-no. And when I wrote this book, well, first there was a really ugly little book by Doris Faber, Eleanor and Hick. She was the first person to get, this was 1980, she was the first person to have to look at the letters, and she was horrified. And she went on this campaign to get the papers closed because they were horrifying to her. And since she couldn't get them closed, she decided she would write a book saying these letters couldn't possibly mean what they seemed to mean, since Eleanor was a saint and a mermaid. And that became the absolute rhythm of the story. And so I wrote a really kind of nasty review, essentially saying, Pace and these thousands of letters, Pace Freud, a cigar may not always be a cigar, but the northeast corner of your mouth upon my lips is always the northeast corner. And then folks started to say, why don't you write about Eleanor Roosevelt? And I said, God has forgiven me. I said, don't be ridiculous. I'm a military historian. I do hard history, which is all I did until that point, except I wrote some articles about the historical denial of lesbianism while I was working on my Eisenhower book. Kate Stimson kept sending me books to review to cheer me up in Abilene, Kansas, which was a terrible place to have to do an Eisenhower book. It was a dry town. You couldn't even get wine with dinner, So I had these. Anyway, so I wrote these articles.
Wine and women both
Wine
erased
and
from
women,
history.
right. but I did my Eisenhower book. It had just come out, and folks kept saying, go do it, including, it turns out, Joe Lash. And Joe was a friend. And I didn't know until Robbie Cohen found the proof, the evidence, that it was Joe and the sons who wanted to close the letters. They had, but even though he was horrified by these letters, and so was Truda, and they were friends.
Truda was his wife.
Truda Lash. And, as I say in volume 3, the whole story isn't going to be known until there's really a good biography of Gertrude von Adam Wenzel Pratt Lash, who is really a hero. And she didn't want anyone to know her role in the effort to rescue people. She's really responsible for the Varian Fry Rescue Committee. Anyway, so he said, why don't you do this? And I said to him, no, I'm a military historian, and my Eisenhower book's coming out. And he took me up to Hyde Park and showed me around. And I knew I had a story. He was the good son. Anything Eleanor Roosevelt said, he said anything. She said, I don't believe in power. So he wrote she didn't care about power. Then I knew I had a story. And I thought, it was 1982, I thought I could finish it by her centennial, 1984. Anyway.
Well, you did finish it by her bicentenary.
Yes. But the bottom line is, I'm really enchanted now that there are all these Eleanor and Hick books out. I mean, your novel is, I think, the best, but there are 2 others. And then there's Susan Quinn's book on Eleanor and Hick, just on that relationship. And Susan Quinn says her subtitle is the relationship that formed the First Lady, which I quibble with, and because there were so many important people in Eleanor Roosevelt's life. And if anybody here is looking for a subject, there are 2 great women, great women who were critical to Eleanor Roosevelt's life. Esther Lape, L-A-P-E, I've been saying this for years, who is Eleanor Roosevelt's mentor and guide. And there is no biography of Esther Lape. Her papers are open. I have a whole bunch I'm going to bring to the library that I inherited. But they're going to be at the FDR Library. And she's the woman who wanted health care for all, what we now call single payer. She wanted it in the 1935 Social Security Act, and the AMA lobbied it to death. She fought for it until she died at the age of 100 in 1982. She's a great hero and Eleanor Roosevelt's primary political mentor, and her lifelong partner and lover, Elizabeth Reed, was a great international lawyer whose textbook on international law is used all over the country at Yale and at Harvard. And she became Eleanor Roosevelt's not only attorney, but business consultant and tax person. So it's a great story. Esther Lape, L-A-P-E.
I think we're giving people a new reason to come to our events. You can now leave to write a novel about Eleanor as a high-kicking showgirl, or you could go the Esther Lape route.
Yes. And the other
so it's an inspiration to writers.
Yes, the other subject
everywhere.
Desperately in need of a biography is Marie Souvestre. Her papers are in Paris, but really the Allenswood School, the Lytton Street.
Well, there are novels about her.
There are
already.
Well, yes, Olivia, but there's no biography, and the facts of her life are even more interesting than the novel, in my opinion.
Well,
yes.
I mean, we know a lot about Eleanor. I mean, people here anyway will know a lot about Eleanor Roosevelt. We know the name Lorena Hickok. Why don't both of you talk about her as a historical figure and then as a fictional character? What was important and interesting about her in her own time, and why was she of interest and attractive as a friend, as more than a friend, as a lover to Eleanor Roosevelt? How did they get together? What was the nature of their friendship?
Well, Eleanor Roosevelt was really impressed by this strong, independent. She was a great journalist, and she was known as one of the boys. and she was known as one of the boys because she was a very generous journalist in the field that she was most prominent in. She got the best stories, the biggest bylines. Her columns were syndicated by the Associated Press all over the country. And Eleanor Roosevelt was one of her assignments. And Eleanor Roosevelt was immediately smitten. Now, in the sexism and homophobia of our culture, she's called unattractive, obese, fat, chubby, uninterested. The fact is, she was very full-breasted, and she's rather attractive in a very butch sort of way. But it was really her personality. She had a great sense of humor, and she was this open-hearted, generous person who had lived a very hard life. Her mother died when she was very young. Her father was abusive and alcoholic, and Eleanor Roosevelt, I think, people always ask, how did Eleanor get to be one of the most generous, giving people in the world? Why did she identify with people on the margin, outside of, people in want and need and trouble? And the answer really is, she was an orphan daughter of an alcoholic father who died at the age of 34. How much do you have to drink to die at the age of 34? We're still here. Almost 100. So the bottom line is she really identified with Hick, who was not unlike Earl, identified with Hick and loved her very immediately.
And Amy, did you think of these childhoods that they had that were in many ways so different, but had, as Blanche says, almost the same kind of scheme, emotional scheme, that this was something that drew them together or kept them?
In the novel, they share their childhoods with each other, but Lorena is very mindful of the fact, as she says, people like their tragedies to match up. Your broken arm, my broken arm, not your broken arm, my mass murder. And my vision of Lorena is somebody who was very mindful of her upbringing, always mindful of having been a hired girl. It's one of the reasons that she admires Franklin Roosevelt so much, as he is her kind of president, and like Eleanor, sort of wants to stand up for people who have been unappreciated or badly treated. But also, I think, from my vision of her, I felt that she would be somebody who would also be mindful of the fact that it is terrible to lose your parents. They are both orphans, but perhaps a little easier if you have a wealthy grandmother and a nice boarding school to go to, as opposed to being sent off to work as a hired girl when you're 13 or 14 years old. And so part of what was interesting to me, because it is so clear from the letters and from the historical material, how drawn they were to each other and the things that they had in common. And I do think that there was a way in which the relationship was often unseen and for so many years either trivialized or ignored or banned. I have to say, if you're doing a study for your own interest of sort of what homophobia looks like on the page, the Doris Faber book is unbelievable. And I had picked it up. I had sort of fallen across it, actually in a Northampton used bookstore. And my copy has on the flyleaf an inscription that says, "Dear Trixie, you're not going to believe this homophobic rant about what we know was a great love story. Homophobia, our worst enemy, loves Shelley." And I was like, there you have it. And so I feel like they were not a couple who were a suitable object for the male gaze. There's a great photograph from old Hollywood of Marlene Dietrich and Greta Garbo in T-shirts and slacks in a playground. And I don't think there is a breathing person who looks at that photograph and doesn't think, I'm in, Lorena and Eleanor, maybe not so much, and certainly not for the male journalists. And so there was a way of just not seeing them. And so part of what was a lot of pleasure to write about is their love affair and their physical life together. And, you know, as Lorena says at one point, what does not look beautiful feels beautiful. And I wanted to write about a love affair that was not between people who were young and glamorous.
Well, how did you come to the frame of your book? Because it's so well done. I'm not giving too much away. I mean that
There are not a lot of spoilers. I mean, you know, the book is there.
it's
Well,
after
you get her voice so vividly. That's
so glad.
really
Lorena
for me,
Hickok's voice.
Yes, it's Lorena Hickok's voice. I would assume that's perfect, a perfect pitch
I'm so
for her
glad.
voice. Yeah, it's really great. I want to, I'm
Oh,
sorry.
well, you go ahead and then I'll go ahead.
Okay. One of our goddaughters, who's not here, Anna Stessinger, who's Caroline Stessinger's daughter, A Life of Music, said she's miserable not to be here because her favorite quote from her favorite short story, Silver Water, by Amy Bloom. And she gave me her favorite quote, which I'd like to read from your, it turns out this is your first short story?
It is.
I didn't know that. My sister's voice was like a mountain, water in a silver pitcher. The clear blue beauty of it cools you and lifts you up beyond your heat, beyond your body. After we went to see La Traviata, when she was 14 and I was 12, she elbowed me in the parking lot and said, "Check this out." And she opened her mouth unnaturally wide, and her voice came out, so crystalline and bright that all the departing opera goers stood frozen by their cars, unable to take out their keys or open their doors until she had finished. And then they cheered like hell. Now that quote made me wonder if you chose Lorena Hickok because opera was her life's blood and divas were the source of her life's quest.
That certainly was a piece of it. I mean, there were just aspects of Lorena that I felt I could imagine. The hardest thing for me with this novel was, for a long time, who's going to tell the story? Who's going to? I certainly was not going to. I was not going to have Eleanor Roosevelt narrate the story unless I was going to have Blanche reciting all the lines for me next to me. But and then I had a fictional character, Parker Fisk, who's based
And
on
who
a
is-
character,
Oh yeah,
Who
who
is
is
he
he
based
based
on?
on? We were wondering that.
Sumner Wells.
Oh,
Oh.
really? Okay. I thought he was based on that cousin who, okay. But
Yeah, no, I was
Sumner
spoiled
Wells,
for
yes,
choice. I mean,
yes,
there were
Sumner
plenty of
Wells,
people
right.
to
Who's
base.
drunk and queer, yeah, that's right.
Who
If you
gives
say
there's,
so.
there's just to fill you in without giving anything away, there's a character who moves the story along with a great deal of background, and it's a fictional character, but Blanche and I had wondered before you arrived who Parker Fisk was based on. So now is the historical character Sumner Wells.
Yes, one of the nicest compliments I got was a friend of mine early on said, "I have spent all day Googling Parker Fisk. Where the hell is Parker Fisk?" I was like, well, I understand. So I played around with a lot of narrators, and you just sort of as happens sometimes for me when I'm writing a novel, just at the point where I'm thinking, I just got to chuck this. I can't. I thought, maybe I just go back one more time to Lorena and see if she could actually tell the story. And then I could hear her. And what I heard her, I could hear her talking about her terrible childhood. And I've been in South Dakota several times, so I also shared her feelings about South Dakota. And, sort of like the way you feel about Abilene. And once I could hear her, I could write the book. Mm-hmm. And for me, there were so many reasons she was a wonderful narrator, including the fact that she was such a great journalist and such a great observer. I mean, I didn't have to create a character who would have observations that I, as the author, wished them to have. She was a great observer. She was a good writer. She had a great sense of humor. She had a wonderful sense of music, and also her strong sense of being the outsider was really something that I wanted. I wanted somebody who was very engaged in the White House and with the Roosevelts, but also could always stand back and look and sort of think, rich people, different.
Well, I mean, but what I thought was so well done, in addition to the voice of Lorena Hickok, is, as I was saying, the frame is that after Franklin Roosevelt has died, Lorena Hickok and Eleanor Roosevelt are meeting again later in the month of April. And what was very moving is that, well, the protectiveness that Lorena Hickok felt toward Eleanor Roosevelt and the low ebb that Eleanor Roosevelt had reached, obviously, at that moment in grief, and then other hurts pile on, I mean, as the story unfolds. And it seemed to me a beautiful moment in their lives where Lorena Hickok's feelings, which had been so bruised at many times, had sort of moved to the side or fallen away, and that Eleanor Roosevelt, as a person needing protection, is a very unusual perspective to take on her. And usually she seems so unassailable in her activity, her endless activity. And here's a moment where she, at least even if it's only for a few weeks, is inactive. And so that was a very unusual moment in their lives, it seemed to me. Was that something that you found difficulty coming to, or was that something you started out with?
I tend to play a lot with time and memory in all my novels, and this one seemed to me to be set up like a daisy, like the center. By the way, this is only something I sorted out like 3 weeks ago, but now it seems to me it was set up like a daisy, and the center is the weekend, which a friend of mine who is a playwright said to me, oh, if it were a play, the play would be the weekend that they spend together after Franklin's death. And then sort of all the petals around it are all of the memories and things that have happened in the past that have sort of brought them to that moment. And so, because I wanted the center of the book to be the present. I mean, my feeling about writing something like this is you don't want the reader to experience it as a sort of a set piece or a description of the past. You want them to enter it as if it's April 1945 and be there. And so all of that is written in the present tense.
And what did you, I mean, the other nice thing is that it's a time, a story, a moment where Franklin Roosevelt, I mean, of course, he's just died, so he's present, but is not shaping their relationship or their ability to be together or not to be together. And I liked that he's basically on the sidelines of this story. I mean, he comes in, and Lorena Hickok has her own ideas about him. What was Lorena Hickok's view of Franklin and Eleanor as you understood it, and then as you understood it and tell it in your novel? Oh.
I would defer to you.
Well, I mean, Eleanor Roosevelt and Franklin were partners. And I think what you said about how she forgave him immediately, she felt people would not criticize him, people would not push him, and she felt that was her role, especially when it came to very great issues like segregation. She couldn't believe that he wouldn't desegregate the military. And she kept really pushing him to do that all through the last years of his life, so that, she would put little notes in and he would get increasingly angry. And there's that moment when Anna writes about, and I want to ask you about Anna, writes about how he throws everything on the floor when Eleanor is pushing him and pushing him. And there's the whole question of his failure to rescue, which Eleanor Roosevelt again goes around. But after he passes, she says all she does for the rest of her life is to fulfill his promise, is to fulfill his mandate. So the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that's his legacy. And she never takes any credit for it. And she never, of course, criticizes him. For me, one of the most shocking things was how she forgave not only all of the women around him, but even her mean and rotten, nasty cousin, Polly, who tells her everything. And we know that she becomes very great friends at the end of her life with Polly. So she forgives everybody all of their
Trespass.
all of the things that made her life so hurtful and hard in the marriage. She just forgets it. Bless it and release it. I mean, that's an amazing part of the story.
I agree. I mean, I think also, when I was thinking about the relationship with Polly and with so many people, first of all, life is long. And there is also, as you say, a certain kind of, not just peace in forgiving, but a certain kind of power. And I think Eleanor was not unaware of that in her relationships, that there is a capacity. A lot of people don't have her capacity to be gracious, but also there is not only a kind of strength in it, but it's a strong position to have. To forgive you, you are not in charge of me. I am not held by my anger towards you. I have more strength in that relationship. That moment where she sends the little watercolor of the Shumatov portrait to Lucy Mercer Rutherford, who I am still mad at, and I didn't even know these people. That's extraordinary, and that struck me as both very gracious and very powerful.
That's really interesting. So one of the things that is so interesting, I have two questions. One is, I'm very struck when I met Susan Quinn, who is happily married and goes everywhere with her husband. I asked her why she, as a straight woman, wrote the Eleanor and Hick book. And the second novelist also is a straight woman in North Carolina. And I was really curious why all these straight women are writing about, with so much feeling and love, this lesbian relationship now. So I asked, we were together at the Tucson Book Fair, and I asked her bluntly, so how did you decide to write about Eleanor and Hick? And she said she thought it would help her understand her lesbian daughter better. And I thought that was terrific. But how do you understand this current rhapsody change that's happened?
The changes happen sort of in the world in which people are more interested in the relationship. Well, I think, the arc bends slowly, but it bends. And there is, well, I have to tell this story. So I was at a friend of mine said, a writer's camp, and I met this extraordinary woman whose name is Goldie Goldblum, who is online in charge of all the LGBT connections within the Orthodox Jewish community.
Woo!
She was so awesome. She was so awesome. And
That's really
oh, I
awesome.
know. She was just I was just mad for her. And so she came from Australia, which has a very big, very ultra-Orthodox community, and she comes to the States, and she's married, and she has 8 kids, and she leaves her husband, and she gets divorced, and she comes out, and she makes it her life work to be a help and a comfort and a source for all gay people within the ultra-Orthodox community. Wow. And so she says to me, she's the nicest person ever. She says to me in the kitchen, she said, I was so interested in the book, The White Houses. She said, if I might ask, what is your particular interest? Which I just thought was like the most charming way to put it. And what I said is, that my interest was as a novelist and also as a queer woman. And also, I think that people are responding to this book so much now. First of all, I think there is a longing to see stories about great and complicated people leading complex and honorable lives, especially at the head of our government. So I think there is sort of longing as well as interest. And I also think with this, I feel like people haven't seen the story before. So some people heard rumors when they were in school, and some people didn't hear rumors. But I don't think we have that many images of great and lasting love in which nobody throws themselves off a cliff or marries the farmer or whatever it is that happens in sort of tragic lesbian stories of the past, or both, you know. I guess marries the farmer, throws themselves off the cliff. And I think that there's something very engaging for gay and for straight readers and for men and for women about this long life between these two women and the way in which a great love story is a great love story, and it captivates people.
Well, and it's a great story. I mean, it's a love story because it's a story of true friendship. And what I thought after reading the book is Eleanor Roosevelt lives until 1962. The moment that after Franklin's death in 1945 is almost midway, but it's actually exactly midway between the time that they met in 1928 and Eleanor Roosevelt dies in 1962. And so it's an interesting hinge moment when Eleanor Roosevelt is finally free, and yet their relationship is a long romantic friendship, and you get this wonderful sense of the panoply of emotions and intimacies that happen over time, including anger and resentment, and so the full color of that emotion comes through in the book.
The letters, for me, in addition to the letters that Blanche talks about, which are just clearly romantic letters, there's a little chunk of letters after Lorena is with Marion Harron. And Eleanor, they are just the letters that any of us would write to our former partner, who now seems horribly happy with a new person. And aren't we pleased? Sure, we're super pleased. And maybe you'd like to come to lunch, and I can check her out. But, you know, I'm so happy for you. That's what I've been really hoping would happen. And they're just so clearly those letters. And that, for me, was as powerful and persuasive as the romantic letters themselves. These were people who were just so engaged with each other.
Yeah, and then there are Hicks' letters to Marion Harron, in which Marion Harron really wants an exclusive relationship.
I know, poor Marion.
Poor Marion.
Yeah,
and
really.
Hicks says
That's another
essentially, no, I don't want an exclusive relationship, because part of her heart is still devoted to Eleanor Roosevelt. And
Yes, possibly more honest than one would have really hoped to have heard.
Yeah.
You know. But
so
like,
they break up. But yeah, it's very interesting. I have one other question.
sure. How would I not answer your question?
So, like, I agree with almost everything in your book and all of your conclusions except one. And I don't understand it, and I want to know, why are you so mean to Anna?
No, poor Anna. I know.
Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's daughter.
Franklin
The
Eleanor
daughter.
Roosevelt's daughter. I feel that I would want to begin by saying, I am not personally mean to Anna Roosevelt because we don't have a relationship. But in the novel,
Lorena Hickok.
Lorena Hickok.
yes, I mean, that's really part of it, actually. Lorena Hickok is. I don't feel that this is necessary, I feel like this is my character. I mean, not me, not my own nature.
Okay.
But I feel like there are
So
things.
Hick was that mean to Anna?
I feel that, well, I also want to point out that what, the part of what, most of what goes on actually is Hick's thoughts about Anna. What she actually says to her is, your mother's sleeping, she can't come to the phone, and you kids always push your mother aside to please your father. Now, it is true that in her aside of her own inner monologue, she says that if Anna's father was Stalin, she'd be counting up dead Jews and chilling the vodka. So that's true. That's not nice. But I feel that...
That comes from one of the letters that Lorena Hickok burned.
No. But I
Well, it was ashes.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it was ashes.
Yeah.
But I think that part of it, for me, was her tremendous protectiveness towards Eleanor. And that it seemed possible to me that she would have a lot of anger towards somebody who had put her beloved Eleanor in that excruciating situation, to have to go down to Warm Springs, to then have to find out what had been arranged behind her back, and that her daughter had done it. And so really, it was not my wish in particular to punish Anna, but I did think that Lorena was a fierce protector, and that this would be, she would just feel that that was not the right thing to have done.
I accept that.
I'm so glad.
Well, I feel
That's
that
great.
we
That's
might
really
want
great.
to end our portion of the conversation on a moment of peace and amity.
Yeah.
But before we go to questions, I want to ask one more question, which I hope will not create violence between you. That you wrote in your first volume in 1992, that the question that animated you as you approached the book was, who was Eleanor Roosevelt? Because the documentary material until your biography had sort of left her as a kind of mythic figure. And in answering the question, who is Eleanor Roosevelt, how much is the historian, even with documentary evidence, relying on a kind of imaginative leap into that material? And then I'd like to hear what you as a novelist think of that question, about your role.
Yeah, that's a great question, Billy. The fact is, unlike many historians, I don't make anything up. If I can't quote it from a letter or a document, I don't extend it. The ironic thing is, although every word is based on letters and documents, the reaction to my first volume was horror, as you said. And I would really like everybody who is interested in the evolution of this to read Robbie Cohen's wonderful review, Out of the Closet and Into History, the Eleanor Roosevelt-Lorena Hickok affair. Because what he does, and this is published in Reviews in American History by Johns Hopkins, my other alma mater, in the summer of 2017. And he goes through all of the really hateful reviews of the book that continued for years. And it was just very hard for American readers in that strata of historians to accept that this was really true. I mean, the historical denial of lesbianism continued, really until very recently, which is why I asked that first question, how do you explain it? And I'm very grateful to Robbie for reminding us that it was really quite a journey. But I just stick to the facts. I mean, I was, schooled as a military historian. If it's not in a document, I don't make it up, even though the guns are forged secretly.
And yet, at the same time, you talk about how the letters were so amorous and specific, and yet other people looking at the same documentary evidence said they don't mean
They couldn't
what
possibly mean what they
So,
seem to mean. Right.
Which just seemed crazy. I mean, once you look at the letters, I think, first of all, your description of yourself as somebody who writes the facts, I think I do think you don't make things up, but you also look at the facts and you hold them up to the light, which is a real gift as a historian. It certainly was a gift to me, looking at that history. But also, to read the letters and then read these claims, you just think it's like Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
You feel like somebody's sort of looking at you going, I know you think those are stripes. And a lot of people might call them stripes, but don't be fooled. Those are not really, you're like, They're stripes. There's nothing else there. They're stripes. And that's how it is when you look at the letters.
And then there's the distortion, buck-toothed, ugly Eleanor and pudgy, ugly Hick.
Right. Couldn't be.
Those distortions, they couldn't possibly love each other, and they couldn't possibly have love in their life because they're both so unattractive. And that's really a theme that runs through it.
Right, and they
Right.
were mindful of that. I mean, they were, these were not people who lived, in a cave. They were both very mindful about the greater world. And, so part of the pleasure of creating their relationship in the novel is their understanding of the outer world, and their also creation of their sort of intimate and inner world. The facts, to me, sort of open the door to
A celebration.
a celebration and also sort of an illumination. This is another way to see, and this is an exploration of how love is.
Well, thank you, Amy Bloom. Thank you, Blanche Wiesencook. We'll go to questions from the audience. We have a microphone coming around. Please raise your hands and wait for the microphone. Up here.
Hi. How difficult is it when you're writing a novel about a real person, especially somebody as important as Eleanor Roosevelt, to maintain the integrity, but at the same time, you want to take dramatic license? It is a novel. Was there ever a time when you felt you had to step back or rethink what you were going to write?
Well, I step back and rethink what I'm writing all the time because I'm a slow writer and I do a lot of revising. So that's always the case, whether it's a historical figure or somebody I've imagined. And in some ways, the issue is not that different. I mean, I did have a lot of information about these people, a great deal about Eleanor and somewhat less about Lorena, which is one of the reasons I chose her as the narrator. But even when the characters wholly my imagination, they have their own integrity. And so there's a great line from John Gardner in The Art of Fiction, which is a wonderful, his fiction you don't have to read, but the book about writing fiction is fantastic. And he says, the novel is a dream that you create for the reader, and you will try to avoid mistakes, errors in diction, errors in dialogue, having your characters do things that don't make any sense for their temperament and their personality. And if you can avoid those errors, the reader can enter the dream and they don't have to leave it until they close the covers. And that's my goal. And so whether the character is historical or entirely of my imagination, my intention is sort of the integrity of that character. And my own inclination as a writer is that as adults, events tend not to make us who we are, they tend to reveal who we are. And so part of my wish is to write a story that allows my characters to reveal themselves to the reader. And that's true either way. This was more of a constraint. It was a little bit more like, being a poet and suddenly going, I am going to write haiku. There's a shape that you have to allow for, but it doesn't determine what's going to be inside the poem.
In the back.
I apologize for my confusion. Eleanor was married to Franklin. They had a family. What defines a gay woman? She had a relationship with a man. Did she have other relationships with women, with men? What really was the essence of her sexuality?
You want to take that, boss?
But I don't know what you mean by the essence of her sexuality. I think of Eleanor Roosevelt as a serial romantic. She fell in love lots of times. We know that she had a very intense relationship with Earl Miller. Claire and I agree about most things, but we don't agree about the possibility of Eleanor Roosevelt having an affair, actually, with Earl Miller, but I have a picture in volume 1, her hand on his knee. And when you look at the two of them in bathing suits with, his muscles and how snuggly they all are, I created a question, why not? Given that Franklin had serial affairs, I don't know if she was making love or keeping score, I wrote at one point. But there's no doubt that her great beyond Franklin relationship is with Lorena Hickok.
Yeah.
Her other great beyond Franklin relationship is with Earl Miller. And Joe tells a story about how there
Joe
were
Lash.
Joe Lash, about how there were hundreds and hundreds of letters from Eleanor Roosevelt to Earl Miller, which all of a sudden disappeared. And in the other novel about Hick, the Hick subject, Hick contemplates the disappearance of those letters and why she won't give her letters to Joe over my dead body, she says, because somebody the Sons bought Earl Miller's letters and then destroyed them, is what this other novelist suggests. Well, they're destroyed, is all we know. They're gone. And so now that we know from Robbie Cohen that Joe tried to destroy these letters, hey, maybe that's what happened. So we don't know about Earl Miller. And then there are other people in Eleanor Roosevelt's life, not as many as in Virginia Woolf's life, but there's no question about her intense relationship with Hick. Now, I suggest that in my book that it's sort of over about 1936. Well, what's over? The intensity of their physical relationship is over. But their friendship and their romance and their need for each other endures to the end. So I can't relate to your question about essential sexuality, but as I said, Eleanor Roosevelt is a serial romantic, and there are lots of people in her life, one after another.
I think maybe the other piece about sort of the idea of the essence of somebody's sexuality is that, it seems that people are on a continuum and that people have been
Fluid.
seen on a continuum for the last 5,000 years. I mean, it's not a new sort of thing. And so you have sort of a range, and people move, and also people have their own natures. And so it seems to me that if the culture doesn't require you to fit into a particular shaped spot, then people move around. And that seems to me to be actually sort of the way it is about people's natures. And there are people whose natures are, if it was the end of the world and they were faced with somebody of the opposite sex, they would say, I'll pass, thank you very much. And there are people who, if it was the end of the world and they were faced with somebody of the same sex, they'd be like, I'll pass. And so, actually those are sort of the far ends, but I think lots of human beings are in the middle, maybe
Are
not.
fluid.
Are fluid and maybe not so essential. I think that would be our combined
And then
thoughts
as-
on the
Yeah.
subject.
I think in
this gentleman.
in your book, Amy, you say, I think you give this thought, it's Lorena Hickok speaking about or thinking about Eleanor Roosevelt, that intimacy was a commingling of souls.
For
So I-
her.
for her.
For her.
Yes.
So I think that may be the answer to that question. I mean, I didn't mean to cut
Yeah,
you
yeah,
off.
yeah. No, I think
So-
Yeah.
that was.
And then in your biography, you say, I think you as the writer say, if transparency is a sign of true love, then Eleanor Roosevelt's honesty in her letters and in her conversation. I think
I think that's actually
Oh,
what
that's
I
you?
say.
Okay, well,
I think that's me.
okay, well then, if transparency is a sign of true love,
Then I was loved like nobody's business.
Okay,
is
so
what she said.
I ascribed it incorrectly, but thank God we have the fact checker
Right.
present.
Well, I think that for me, Virginia Woolf says it best. We know about, I mean, she is a fluid person in history, but she writes, when somebody says, do you really like to bed women and how do you do it? Her answer is, women alone stir my imagination.
Yeah.
We have time for one more question over here. Hi. Oh, wait for the microphone, please.
I just have so much gratitude for this book. It felt like a dream come true. Amy, you were talking about dreams. I loved when Eleanor wore the Sulka pajamas and they broke the bed. I loved the kind of polyamorous picture that I got of the Roosevelt family. And I was very struck by the end when Lorena didn't.
Oh, don't say the end.
Oh.
No.
Spoiler alert.
Read the book. Well,
She was
I-
moved by the end. That's
I-
what we heard.
Yes, it's very moving, yes.
I had a question
Sorry,
about the
no,
end.
please.
It's all right.
Sure. Well,
Yeah? I just wondered if
Oh,
there
yes,
was,
I didn't want her to tell the end. That's
Okay.
all.
the question tells the end a bit, but did Lorena go to the funeral? And
She did not.
she didn't
No.
go to the funeral. And then was there any evidence of the trip that you?
there is.
Yeah,
There is.
oh.
The person providing the evidence is sitting next to me. Yeah, so again, I really did my best because it was interesting to me. It was an interesting challenge to work from as many known facts as I could. It's not to say that there are plenty of things that are made up because it's a novel. I think this is the only book I've ever written in which I had to say both at the beginning and at the end, hi, it's a work of fiction, you know, and then, come to the end, and it's still a work of fiction. But I did work a lot from the facts of their relationship, which lent themselves so much to storytelling.
But it's an essential, it's the essence of their relationship. It's beyond a work of fiction and fantasy and essential reality.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Amy. Thank you, Blanche. Please join us upstairs for a reception and book signing, and thank you all for coming.